Hello, and welcome to FHIR Subscriptions. My name is Gino Canessa, and in this video, I'll be taking you on a quick tour through FHIR Subscriptions, kind of where we are as of right now, that is August of 2021, kind of in preparation for the Connectathon in September, Connectathon 28. This video is going to be a kind of high-level overview about what subscriptions are, the changes that have been made if you're familiar with them before, and kind of how you would use them and why. The next video we'll get into a walkthrough of the actual implementation guide, and then after that we'll do some videos on live coding and try and get through some of the examples in some different languages. With that said, let's jump right in. A little different than usual. Today we're going to be using a PowerPoint deck. So this link here, aka.ms/subscriptions2021, that will have this deck and a few others that are there. I try to keep historical ones present in case that is useful for people. So that's there, and there are a lot of links later. So if that's what you're looking for, I highly suggest using that instead of trying to capture them here. So what are subscriptions? Why do we need them in FHIR? We'll start with saying that FHIR, as most people are familiar with, is generally centered around a RESTful model. You can search for things, you can query for things, the standard CRUD operations that you're used to: create, read, update, delete. The client can talk to the server and kind of ask it to do whatever it wants. That works great for a lot of things. However, we do end up with this polling problem. And that's to say that if a client is interested in new data, you're saying that, I need to know a new encounter, a new visit, a new medication, a new condition, whatever it is that I'm interested in, the only way a client can find out is by repeatedly asking the question. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Is there new data? Is there new data? This can be particularly troublesome if the data you're looking for is complicated. If you want to know when a given patient that has had a given condition and been hospitalized has an observation outside of a certain range, those kinds of queries can get very expensive for servers, and to be asking them repeatedly just on the off chance a new piece of data is there isn't a great workflow. So what we want is the server to tell us. We want to know when the thing happened, when the new data is present. Instead of asking repeatedly, the server knows what happened. The server knows everything that changes. And so it would be nice if we could just tell the server, this is the thing we're interested in. Let me know when that happens. Problem solved. We're done. We don't need to do anything else. We have subscriptions, and we're out of the way. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. This is a pretty widespread use case, and so it was identified well back in the DSTU2 days, which by computer standards is ancient history. However, a lot has happened over time. So the first thing that I want to always note here are that there's two kind of subscription-like things that split off from the initial starting point. And those are FHIRcast and CDS hooks. There's plenty of information. I can put some links if people are interested. But essentially, FHIRcast is used for mostly context synchronization, saying that I have a user that might have 2 or 3 or 4 applications open, and I need to be in real time describing what the user's doing and keeping everything in sync. Kind of one of the perennial examples of that is radiology, where you might have the EMR, the transcription service, the viewer, and all these different applications open. When you open a new patient in one or a new study in one, you don't want to have to go and reopen it in every different app. So that's kind of the good example of that. So if that's what you're interested in, you want FHIRcast. CDS hooks also split off, and that is for kind of this closed loop communication circle that you want to happen. So sometimes the thing that you're asking about is, I want to prescribe a new medication, is it appropriate? Or I want to order this particular diagnostic test, is it appropriate? And in those cases, what you need to do is you need to find out, do your clinical decision support operation, and then come back to where you were in the workflow. So it's kind of this, something has happened, let me pop out, do the thing I need to do, and then pop back in. And so that's what the CDS Hooks project is about. And again, if you're looking for that, let me know and I can put together links, but a search will take you to either one of those quite easily. So while all of this was happening, the core of subscriptions had moved from DSU2 to SDU3 to R4, and people were getting a little more engaged with the project and finding out that some of the use cases didn't work very well, the solution that was in place. So back in 2019, FHIR Infrastructure said, let's start a rework of subscriptions that we'll put into R5, which is fantastic. However, in 2020, people all said, well, R5 is far enough out that we really need something that we can do in R4 as well. So we actually started a backport implementation guide that worked on R4. And then over the course of the years of working on that, we realized that it would be a lot better to implement if we waited for R4B, which is being released shortly, to add a couple of new resources that weren't in R4. So it's essentially a point release of R4. It'll actually be numbered, I believe, 4.1.0. But that way it's still R4, still compatible, but the new resources are available that make the implementation a lot better. Again, just to briefly, I don't want to spend too much time here, but just to cover from R2 to R4, the way subscriptions worked, in case people are familiar with that or curious what that was, are result sets. Essentially, a client would just give a server a query and say, whenever the results of this query change, let me know. It looked great on paper, and that's why for some use cases it works very well. But there's issues with scale, for instance. If you talk about a server that has millions of records, thousands of clients that might have multiple subscriptions each, keeping track of all of those result sets aren't really great. It's not a great story to tell. Same thing with what queries the server would actually perform. As we know in FHIR, just saying you implement FHIR doesn't mean you implement every resource and every kind of combination of search parameter and different things that you might want. So a lot of times clients would ask for a query and the server would just say, no, that's not supported. And you got into this trial and error system of trying to figure out exactly which pieces the server wanted to do. Maybe it was includes or rev includes or a search parameter or different things. And so really what it comes down to is that for some use cases, this worked very well. And for other use cases, it was not feasible. So that takes us to the redesign. The biggest thing was making subscriptions topic-based. So if you're familiar with WebSub, PubSub, whichever term you're more comfortable with, but kind of just a topic-based subscription model that you say, not, oh, here's a query, but here is an advertised topic that the server supports, and I want to subscribe to that. This is one of the new resources, subscription topic, and it's describing a conceptual event. It defines what filters are allowed. So for instance, you don't want to know on every single patient admission. You want to know on one particular patient's admission, things like that. So we'll get into more details here in a little bit. We also wanted to add more flexibility to subscriptions. In the initial model, there were some things that were very locked down as far as the types of channels, what the payloads looked like, things like that. And we wanted more flexibility to cover more use cases. So really a lot of quality of life things. And then changing to the notification format to support those same types of changes. After we had done all that work, then we came back to the R4 and R4B, the backport implementation guide and the new resources. As I like to say, all the functionality, half the weight, with the idea being that this can be implemented and in production much sooner for people. And that's important for different regulatory things, and just functionality-wise, this is something that a lot of people want. So, as I mentioned, we did add these resources to R4B. So that should be, again, 4.1.0, I believe, and should be released towards the end of 2021 or early 2022. And we'll get into more detail on the resources. That said, we aren't allowed to make any changes to existing resources. So in R5, the subscription resource itself is very different to support all these changes. And that's not on the table for R4 because we have to be completely compatible. So in this case, we have an implementation guide that covers all of the functionality that we need in the subscription resource. So all the different extensions and things like that. Same thing for bundles. In R5, we have a new bundle type so that we have this notification bundle that can tell us about a subscription notification bundle that can kind of filter all the things we need in the way we need them. The closest match we could find is a history bundle, so that's there, and we have it profiled with some different extensions as well. And then we do have some recent additions as people have been engaged over the past couple of years. We had some open issues that we've been working through. One of them is defining events. In addition to just resource triggers, being able to define event triggers. And one of the other big ones is this related resources thing. So we'll jump through both of those here in a little bit. What does that give us? Well, that means when we talk about a subscription, we're really talking about three parts. The first one is the topic. So that's the subscription topic resource. It defines what causes the notification. It sets up what filters are allowed, what types of related resources you would be finding, all those kinds of things that particularly a server needs to know to implement, and then a client needs to know to discover which topic they're interested in. The subscription itself is then really just a way of saying linking like a client's request to a topic. So we're saying we need to link, reference back to the subscription topic. We need to configure the endpoints, the channel information, the payload configuration, all those types of things that you think of as kind of the parts that a client can specify. That all lives in the subscription. And then the last part is this notification. And so that's a bundle. It has a subscription status resource in it that gives you kind of the meta information, the state of the subscription, what contents are in the notification, and then variably the contents of that notification. So subscription topic. This is a canonical resource. It's a definitional resource. That's to say it's not representing, when you talk about, for instance, a patient resource. A patient resource is representing a patient. A canonical resource is saying, well, here's a concept, an idea that we're going to define. One of the nice things is that we can put these in the FHIR registry. So the idea here again is being that we can define common subscription topics that then people will be able to find, derive from if they need additional things, but clients will be able to find them easily. So when you talk about a patient admission, hopefully there will be a very reduced number, hopefully maybe even one, although that might be a bit too ambitious, kind of root patient admission concept, and then any client would be able to find out that a server is advertising their particular flavor by searching for that one canonical patient admission. Again, it describes what causes a notification. This might be human readable text, it might be computable definitions, it might be a state change, it might be an event, it could be a FHIR interaction, kind of whatever someone implementing it needs to know in order to reliably describe this event. It defines the allowed filters. So again, we touched on this a little bit earlier. But if you're doing a patient admission, you need to be able to filter, for instance, on the patient ID. You might want to say I filter on patient group membership if you're using groups to manage kind of these cohorts of patients, whether they're based on payers, payees, groups in research studies, whatever it is. Those kinds of things are very useful to be able to filter on. But it does prevent things like arbitrary level chaining, so that you're not saying, well, I want to filter on my encounter based on a patient that has another encounter that has a particular observation. Those things get very complicated very quickly, and that's not allowed under the current model. And then it also defines the shape. And it's important to note here that these are resources that may be included. So there's a lot of back and forth on it, but essentially if you're saying here's an encounter and it might have a patient in addition to it, a patient is pretty reliably going to exist. And generally speaking, if you have access to see an encounter, you should be able to see the patient. But you might say I'm also including medications. Medications might be tagged that they are not available to a given access level. So if they're tagged sensitive or things like that, then you might not have access to those. And so even if it exists, it may or may not actually be present, and that's going to be the server's discretion. So a couple of examples here. One of them is this patient admission that we've been talking through. It's kind of the primary use case that we've used just to work through all of these types of things. You can see it's based on the encounter resource. We're looking for a specific status. We have a couple of basic filters. We have some additional resources we might want to include. You can see, to carry the example into something else, like an explanation of benefit. There's an EOB resource. You would want it, for instance, on the create interaction. You might want some of the same filters about patient ID and group membership that we used, but you also might want to say you're exposing filters on facility or provider or payee. And in addition to kind of the EOB resource, you might want the patient, the organization, the resource, the location, some of those different types of things. And you can build those up in the definitions, and then since they're in the registry, then all that work doesn't have to be repeated in every use case and scenario. So in a little more detail, we'll go through some of the parts of the actual resource here. And we're, again, looking at the patient admission one. And so then we talk about like a resource trigger. So in this case, what we're saying is we want to work with the encounter resource. We have a description. Obviously, this is a short one because this is a PowerPoint deck, but it's just the beginning of a clinical encounter. And really, that's clear enough that most people can work from it. In FHIR path, you might say that. And again, there's definitions for things like this previous and current variable to say that the previous is the state before the operation is applied, and the current is the one after. So what we're looking for is whenever the previous status is not in progress and the current status is in progress. This is a very basic definition. It doesn't have all the null checking and different things like that, but you get the flavor of what it is. All of that's expressible in FHIR path. Another way we have of defining them is this query criteria. So essentially, we're just giving it these two previous and current. So we're saying anytime the previous encounter has a status that is not in progress, and the current has a status that is in progress. Since we can't do anything like the null checking in queries, we have these additional fields to say things like require both is true, so we need to hit both of these. And if we're creating, the previous doesn't exist, obviously, and so we want to say that the test passes during the create. Whereas, for instance, in the delete, the current doesn't exist, and so we want to say that the test automatically fails if it's a delete event. Same thing if you look at an event trigger, and there's a little contention around this that I'll want to highlight here in a second, but we do require that you put a FHIR resource as well. And that's to say that there's some resource that this has to be rooted in, even if it's not an actual FHIR interaction that we're looking at. Same description, and this description could be improved a bit, but the whole point here is we're saying we want to use the HL7v2 AO1, ADT AO1 message, which is patient admission. And so when you describe that, many systems will even have that already functioning because obviously plenty of EMRs are already in the HL7v2 world. And so now I can hook this directly into that same software framework and say, well, whenever that event is being triggered, I can take these FHIR actions and kind of help bridge that gap. The can filter by, same thing. We want documentation always, as much as possible. And in this case, we're talking about we want to use the patient key off the encounter resource, and we're looking for equality or an in modifier to say that there's group membership. One of the newer things that we've added relatively recently is this notification shape. So in this case, what we're doing is pairing the root resource with a set of includes. And this will be different. So for instance, if you wanted to say I have a notification that could be on encounter or condition, then you could set up these shapes differently to say, well, if I'm rooting in encounter, these are the types of things I'm going to include. And if I'm rooting in condition, these are the types of things I'm going to include. You know, there's at some point you get to where you need to say, well, this is a different subscription topic altogether. But there are many use cases where you might want several different resources rooted. These are just includes like you would use in a query, the underscore include parameter that you can attach. It's familiar to people that are doing FHIR. Generally, any implementation will already have processing for it. And you can see we can start from this encounter and get the patient, practitioner, service provider, account, diagnosis. This list is actually pulled from the HL7 V2 mapping implementation guide. That it's all the resources that they have listed under the ADT 801 message. So that's the kind of thing, again, as we talked about earlier, you might have no diagnosis. That's okay. If the server has one and thinks that it should include it, it will put it, and vice versa. But this kind of gives clients the idea of what kinds of things they should be expecting. So once we have the topic, then we come back to the subscription itself. So it's a domain resource, so it's just a standard resource. We're linking a topic to a client is really what we're trying to do. So one of the key pieces is this endpoint information. So the channel type, that's just the communications channel we're using, whether it's REST hook, WebSockets, email, so on and so forth. And then all the supporting information. You know, if you're using a REST hook, you need a URL. If you're using WebSockets, you might have some additional information for security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We do need to know the format of notifications. And that's kind of two pieces. One is the MIME type. So if you're expecting FHIR XML or FHIR JSON, you want to be able to specify that. And then the payload type is the amount of data. And again, we'll drill into this a little further there, but it's essentially saying how much information do we want and how many round trips do we need to make in order to get everything. And then the last piece is defining the actual filters. So in the topic, we said you can filter on these things. In a subscription, we're saying we are filtering on them. So channel types. As I mentioned, it's just a method of communication. All we're going to do is say this is how the server is going to tell the client that something has happened. We do have a set of predefined channels. So these are kind of the 80% rule is what FHIR tries to use. Say these should cover at least 80% of the implementation needs. So we have the REST hook, we have the WebSockets, we have emails. Those are particularly good for public health. You know, if you're reporting to your local county about certain diagnosis and things like that, they likely are not going to have a FHIR server stood up. They possibly can't even set up a REST hook. But asking them to have an email address where you can send a notification to, that's a pretty small lift, a pretty small ask. And then FHIR messaging. If you're using FHIR messaging for other things, you want to be able to use subscriptions in it. Otherwise, you know, it's kind of a whole separate set of communications channels. One of the important things is we've made this extensible. So you can create your own, yes, even facts. Graham Grieve is working on facts for a specific set of requirements there. In the reference implementation, I've actually added a Zulip channel that I'm working on drafting an IG for as well. But that gives you the idea. You can build out a channel for whatever you want. So payload types. I was referring to this earlier. and it's controlling the amount of information that goes in the notification. So if we start, we have this ping, an empty payload. This essentially just says something happened on your subscription, you need to figure out what it was, and that's it. Obviously, there's very little information that can leak because there's very little there. But clients might end up needing to do expensive queries back to the server in order to figure out. If I know, for instance, that I'm looking at patient admission topic and something happened, well, I can go ask for encounters, and then from encounters, apologies for that, from encounters, I can go and figure out which ones are new and kind of pick up from there. I'm actually going to jump down to the bottom one because it's easier to do it this way. Full resource is the exact opposite. Full resource is saying, if you're sending me a notification about an encounter, I want the encounter resource in there. If you're including references to patients, put the patient in there. This is very good in trusted environments, especially when you talk about migrating things from HL7v2 into FHIR. You do have to take extra security precautions. A lot of times these are things that you're using certificate pinning and VPNs and different things like that to make sure that the channel is secure and you know who both the sender and the receiver are in a very authenticated, secure way. It also makes a lot of sense in scenarios where you can't easily come back to ask the server again. So again, talking about things like FHIR messaging, if you're doing that because you have intermittent connectivity, you want to include the full resources. You don't want to give them a bunch of IDs, and you don't want to leave it empty because it's going to be very difficult for the client to come back. So the middle ground is the ID only, and that's kind of the in-between. There's very little risk of leaking PHI because all we're doing is sending a bunch of IDs, but it also means that the clients don't have to do complex queries. So in this case, we're going to tell you, yes, an admission happened, and here is the encounter you want, encounter 1, 2, 3, and it's patient ABC, and here's a list of the practitioners and conditions and everything else. So that way the client can just go and ask in one query for all of that information. And it kind of gives this nice blend between the usability of the full resource and the privacy of the empty. So it's kind of the in-between for those. So again, just to kind of hash over this way, we're blending performance and security. It's that constant tug of war that everyone plays with performance and usability on one end and security on the other. So you can see in the ping, the notification only has the subscription ID. So the client has to query the server and retrieve its data. In the ID only, the notification has the subscription ID, but it also has the IDs of all the relevant resources, and so the client can just retrieve data. And then in the full resource, everything's already there, and the client doesn't have to come back to the server at all. So the flexibility is there. Servers will support different things potentially on different channels. If you try to, for instance, put a full resource on a REST hook that's HTTP, not even HTTPS, hopefully the server will just tell you no, and you can kind of figure out from there. So to fill out what it is, again, looking at a patient admission, we might say we want to do a REST hook. We'll give it a URL endpoint, a note, because the server is not really going to know this. It might be a relay. So if you're talking about using your phone or something like that, that you need a push notification, a FHIR server is not going to implement push notifications for the different platforms and all those things. They'll go to a REST hook that'll be a relay to actually convert it to your phone. We'll want a patient filter. Again, if we're using this as a consumer, I want it for my patient admissions, perhaps dependents that I'm the caregiver for. We'll want ID only. This relay could be a non-covered entity that I don't want healthcare information going through. So I don't want to do full resource, and I'm going to want application FHIR or JSON for that. Same thing if you're talking about, for instance, a subscription used internally in a facility. So this time we're looking at something like a medication dispensed type of subscription. In this case, since it's a practitioner that's internal to the facility, they're going to be connecting via WebSockets. We might want to filter on location, so you know a particular building, ward, whatever you're actually interested in. Since this is just connecting internal via WebSockets and we have lots of authentication in place, we can do full resource and JSON as well because that's easier for a web client to process in general. So those are a couple of examples, and this is just going through the details of it. Again, you can see we're just picking up those same things we were talking about, that we have endpoints and contents and the filters and all these different things set up, and that's kind of there. We'll get into more detail on that on future videos. So what is your notification? What do you actually get? In R5, as I mentioned earlier, we have a nice subscription notification bundle that specifically meets the needs of what we want to put in it. In R4, we couldn't add that, so we use a history bundle. The status information, so we have a subscription status resource. And again, this is part of the reason why we're dependent on R4B instead of just R4, the initial version, because that resource has all of the additional information about the subscription. And that always must be entry 0. So this is similar if you have been using FHIR messaging or things like that, that the first resource is the header, has all that meta information. This is the same deal. The bundle's first thing is always going to be the subscription status. And then additional payload, but by configuration. So, again, this is where I was talking about if you want to download the deck instead to get these links, or there'll be, I'll put as many as I can in the links below. But we do have a reference implementation available. Everything's open source. It's all on GitHub. There's more detailed information at this link. There's 3 parts to it. The first one is a server proxy. And so this is just a FHIR server skimmer, for lack of a better term, proxy that says, you know, any of the subscription things I'm going to intercept and handle internally. And then any of the resources that I might be interested in, it right now only supports the admissions topic. So for instance, when an encounter comes in, it grabs a copy and processes it to see if it's supposed to trigger a notification. And it does have an R4 endpoint and an R5 endpoint. This client host project is just in order to be able to test REST hooks, you need something that can set up a REST endpoint that's publicly available, or at least available to the server. So that's what that project is. It's really just a relay that says receive a REST hook notification and convert it to something that the client can understand. In this case, the clients connect via WebSockets. And then the client UI, this is a TypeScript application, a React application that you can use and do that. So one of the future videos, we'll have a guided tour of the reference implementation so that you can see how every piece of that works. Some additional links. This deck, again, and others are at the aka.ms/subscriptions2021 link. There's a few others there from, they're all from this year since it's the 2021 one. A link to the backport IG, kind of the CI build of it, where it is currently, and that'll be a little different from time to time, but as a note, this is actually pointing to a GitHub IO instead of the normal build server, because IG is based on R4B. There's a mess. But we'll keep that up to date, and again, we'll walk through that in the next video. Links to the new R4B resources, so subscription topic, subscription status, the link to the reference implementation, and this last one is the Argonaut Subscriptions Project homepage that's in Confluence, and that has all the kind of current work that we've been tracking over 2021. We generally use the Argonaut project calls as the working calls, and then take issues back to the FHIR infrastructure work group to get voted on and additional feedback. So with that, again, thank you. Hope to see you at Connectathon 28. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out on Zulip, on here. However, you can get a hold of me as usual. And we'll pick up in the next video, kind of doing a walkthrough of the IG and go from there. Thanks. Cheers.